The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when Sarah Nightbrook first arrived at the ruins of Shadowmane Palace, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the storm had been waiting specifically for her. The ancient structure loomed against the gray sky like a broken tooth, its towers crumbling, and its walls covered in ivy that seemed to writhe in the wind with unnatural purpose. Sarah pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders as she stepped down from the carriage, her boots sinking into mud that smelled of centuries and secrets. She was a historian, trained in the modest libraries of the Outer Territories, and this assignment should have been the opportunity of a lifetime. The Council of Valdris had commissioned her to catalog the remaining artifacts in the abandoned palace, a task that would take months and required someone with both scholarly expertise and an Omega's supposedly meek disposition that wouldn't challenge the established narrative about the palace's dark history. What the council didn't know was that Sarah had spent years questioning that very narrative, collecting fragments of truth that didn't align with the official story of how the great Wolf King Fenris Shadowmane had supposedly gone mad with power and turned to dust in a final act of destructive rage 3 centuries ago. The palace doors groaned open at her touch, revealing a vast entrance hall where dust motes danced in the dim light filtering through broken windows. Sarah's wolf stirred uneasily. Inside her, a sensation she'd learned to suppress in public, but couldn't ignore here in this place soaked with old magic and older grief. The air tasted of copper and ozone, and as she walked deeper into the abandoned throne room, she felt the temperature drop with each step until her breath misted before her face. The throne itself sat on a raised dais at the far end of the hall, carved from black stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. According to legend, this was where Fenris Shadowmane had drawn his last breath, where his body had supposedly combusted into ash and disappeared, leaving only scorch marks and the faint outline of shadow beneath the throne that 3 centuries of weather and neglect had never managed to erase. Sarah approached slowly, her scholar's mind cataloging details while her instincts screamed warnings she couldn't quite interpret. The shadow under the throne was darker than it should be, given the ambient light in the room. It had defined edges that seemed wrong, almost deliberate, as though someone had painted it there with ink that never dried. She knelt beside it, pulling out her journal to sketch the pattern, and that's when she felt it. A pulse of awareness, faint but unmistakable, like a heartbeat that originated from the shadow itself rather than from any living thing in the room. Before you continue with this story, if you're enjoying the mysterious atmosphere and want to see where Sarah's discovery leads, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us bring you more supernatural romance stories that blend history, magic, and heart-pounding connections that transcend time itself. And drop a comment below telling us if you've ever felt drawn to a place you'd never been before. Because Sarah is about to discover that some connections are written in blood and shadow long before we're born. Sarah's hand trembled as she reached toward the shadow. Some instinct she didn't understand compelling her forward, even as her rational mind insisted this was impossible. The moment her fingers broke the plane where light met darkness, the shadow moved. Not the way shadows shift when light sources change, but with intention and hunger, wrapping around her wrist like cold silk that burned with an intensity that made her gasp. The throne room plunged into deeper darkness, as every window suddenly covered itself with thick clouds, and Sarah heard a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, from the stone beneath her feet and the air around her, and most disturbingly, from inside her own mind. "Finally," the voice said, and it carried the weight of centuries of waiting, of loneliness so profound it had carved canyons through time itself. "You came back to me." Sarah tried to pull away, but the shadow held firm, not painfully but with absolute certainty, and she felt something ancient stirring in response to the contact, something buried so deep in her own bloodline she'd never known it existed. Her wolf surged forward with unprecedented strength, and suddenly she could see what her normal vision couldn't perceive. The shadow wasn't empty darkness, but a form compressed and bound. A massive wolf spirit trapped in 2 dimensions, and eyes that glowed like embers in the deepest part of a dying fire stared at her with recognition that spanned lifetimes. "I'm not who you think I am," Sarah managed to say, though her voice shook with the effort of forming words when every instinct screamed at her to submit to the power radiating from this impossible being. "I don't know you." The shadow rippled with something that might have been laughter or might have been sorrow, and the voice came again, softer this time, but no less intense. "You are Seraphina of the Luna bloodline, last daughter of the queens who ruled beside the Shadow Kings, and your blood sings the same song that called to me 300 years ago when they tried to erase everything we built together." Sarah's mind reeled because she had no family, no lineage beyond the orphanage records that listed her as a foundling left on the steps, with nothing but a silver pendant she'd worn ever since. She reached for that pendant now with her free hand and felt it grow warm against her skin, responding to proximity to the shadow in a way it never had before. "The Wolf King died," she said, clinging to historical fact like a lifeline, even as that fact began to crumble around her. Fenris Shadowmane turned to dust because his power consumed him. The shadow contracted suddenly, pulling her closer to the throne, and she found herself kneeling in the exact center of that painted darkness, feeling it rise around her like water, like embrace, like coming home to a place she'd been exiled from before she was born. "I did not die," the voice said, and now she could hear the rage beneath the exhaustion, the fury of 3 centuries spent conscious but powerless, aware, but unable to act. "I was betrayed by those I trusted, cursed by a coven of alphas who feared what it would mean if omegas held real power in this kingdom. They murdered my Luna Queen while she carried our child, and when I tried to avenge her, they trapped me here, bound me to shadow and stone, and spread lies that turned my legacy to ash, even while my consciousness remained intact, to witness every moment of what they built on our graves." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, though she couldn't explain why she wept for a king she'd never known, and a history she'd only read in biased texts. But something in his words resonated with a grief she'd carried her whole life without understanding its source, an emptiness that had nothing to do with being an orphan, and everything to do with being severed from a destiny that should have been hers by birthright. "If they killed the queen and the heir," Sarah said slowly, working through the implications, "then how can I be of that bloodline?" The I. Shadow pulsed with something that felt like hope, tempered by centuries of disappointment. "My Luna had sisters, younger daughters of the royal Omega line who fled when the coup began. The betrayers hunted them for decades, but one must have survived long enough to pass on the bloodline in secret, hiding among common wolves, suppressing the royal markers that would have given them away." The shadow began to take more defined shape now, and Sarah could see the outline of a massive wolf that slowly, agonizingly slowly, gained dimension and substance. She understood instinctively that her presence, her blood, her touch was feeding power back into him, giving him the anchor to reality he'd been denied for 300 years. But the process was draining her as well, pulling energy from her core in a way that should have frightened her, but instead felt right, like she'd been carrying a reservoir of untapped power her entire life waiting for exactly this purpose. "If I help you return," Sarah said, because even in this impossible situation, she needed to understand the terms, needed to know what she was agreeing to before she committed fully. "What happens then?" "The council controls Valdris now. They've built their entire power structure on the story of your madness and downfall. They're not going to welcome back a king who can expose their ancestors' crimes." The shadow that was slowly becoming Fenris seemed to smile, though he had no mouth yet to express it. "Then we tear down everything they built on lies and blood, and we rebuild this kingdom the way it should have been 3 centuries ago, with omegas standing equal to alphas, with power based on merit rather than intimidation, with justice instead of oppression." It should have sounded like the fantasy of a mad king, exactly the kind of dangerous idealism the history books warned about. But Sarah had spent years studying the fragments of truth hidden in old documents, the references to Omega scholars and Omega warriors and Omega council members that predated Fenris's supposed fall, all of which vanished from history after his disappearance. She'd read the laws passed in the decades following his death, each one systematically stripping Omegas of rights and resources, framing it as protection but functioning as oppression. She'd seen how the current council maintained power through fear and division, setting alphas against omegas and both against betas, ensuring no unified resistance could form against their corrupt rule. If even half of what this Shadow King claimed was true, then everything she'd been taught about Valdris history was a carefully constructed lie. And the real villains were the ones who currently sat in positions of authority, pretending to be heroes who'd saved the kingdom from a tyrant's reign. "Tell me what I need to do," Sarah said, and felt the shift in the air as her words became commitment, as the bond between them that had been tentative and exploratory suddenly locked into place, with the certainty of a key turning in a lock that had waited 300 years to open. The shadow surged upward, and for a moment, Fenris took full form, a wolf of impossible size, with fur that seemed woven from midnight and eyes that blazed with power that made her own wolf bow, in recognition of an alpha that transcended normal hierarchies. But the form couldn't hold, not yet, and he collapsed back into shadow, with a sound that might have been a growl, or might have been a sob. "The curse that binds me requires royal omega blood freely given over time," he explained, his voice stronger now, but still strained with effort. "Your presence here, your willingness to see the truth instead of accepting comfortable lies, has already begun to break the bonds. But full restoration will take weeks, maybe months, and during that time you'll be vulnerable. The moment the council realizes what you're doing, they'll send everything they have to stop you, because my return means the end of their illegitimate reign." Sarah thought of the life she'd be leaving behind, the quiet existence of a scholar who kept her head down, and her questions carefully academic, never pushing too hard or looking too deep. She thought of the other omegas she'd known, brilliant and capable people forced into subservient roles because that was the only way to survive in a system designed to break them. She thought of the children growing up in a kingdom where half the population was taught from birth that they were lesser, weaker, meant to serve rather than lead. And she thought of the truth buried under centuries of lies, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to excavate it and face the consequences. "I have a cottage about 3 miles from here," Sarah said, making decisions as she spoke, converting theory to action because hesitation now would mean surrendering to a corrupt system she'd never believed in. "It's isolated, protected by old wards that probably haven't been updated since before your time. I can work from there during the day, coming here each night to continue the restoration. If anyone asks, I'm simply doing my job cataloging artifacts. They expect this assignment to take months anyway. If you're invested in seeing how Sarah and Fenris navigate this dangerous path toward his restoration, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next part of their story. And hit that notification bell because we'll be diving deep into the conspiracy that's controlled Valdris for 3 centuries, and the romance that blooms between a king made of shadows and an omega who refuses to let truth stay buried. Drop a comment and let us know what you think the council will do when they realize what Sarah has discovered. The pattern they established over the following weeks would have seemed mundane to any outside observer, but it represented the slow resurrection of power that had been dormant for 300 years, and the building of a connection that defied normal understanding of time and space and the bonds that tie souls together. Each day, Sarah arrived at the palace under the pretense of her scholarly work, and she did catalog artifacts, recording details about tapestries and weapons and documents that told stories the council would prefer stayed forgotten. But each night she returned to the throne room, to the shadow that grew more substantial with every visit, and she sat beside Fenris, while he slowly, painfully, incrementally regained the ability to hold physical form. The process was intimate in ways she hadn't anticipated. It required her to lower all her mental shields, to let him access her energy freely, and in doing so, she gained access to his memories as well. She saw the kingdom he'd ruled, where Omega voices carried equal weight in council decisions, where alphas who abused their strength faced swift justice, where children grew up learning that leadership was about service rather than dominance. She saw his Luna, Queen, Alara, who'd been brilliant and fierce and so deeply kind that her loss still ached in Fenris like a wound that never healed. And she saw the night of betrayal, when trusted advisors revealed themselves as conspirators, when they'd used blood magic and ancient curses to trap him while they hunted down every member of the royal Omega line they could find. Fenris, for his part, saw Sarah's memories of growing up without family, of learning to make herself small and quiet, because Omega, children who showed too much intelligence or too much spirit, ended up broken or disappeared. He saw her secret studies, the way she'd pieced together fragments of the true history while pretending to accept the official narrative. He saw her loneliness, the way she'd never quite fit anywhere because some part of her always sensed she was meant for something more than the limited life Valdris allowed Omegas to have. And he saw her strength, the core of steel wrapped in gentle presentation that had allowed her to survive in a world designed to crush people like her. "You would have been magnificent in my court," he told her one night when he'd managed to hold a semi-solid form for nearly an hour, his voice still rough like wind through dead leaves but growing stronger. "Alara would have loved you. She always said the Omega line produced daughters who were fierce in their compassion and unshakable in their conviction." Sarah felt the familiar ache of that comparison, the knowledge that she was helping resurrect a king who saw his dead mate when he looked at her. "I'm not her," she said quietly, because this truth needed to be established before the bond between them deepened further. "I don't want to be a replacement for what you lost." Fenris's shadow form rippled with emotion too complex for her to fully interpret, but his next words came with a certainty that resonated through the bond growing between them. "You are not a replacement, little scholar. You are a revelation." Alara was spring storms and laughing winds, all light and movement and impossible joy. You are autumn twilight and deep waters, all careful thought and quiet determination. Different songs entirely, but both beautiful, both worthy of being heard and honored in their own right. The words shouldn't have affected her so deeply, but something in her chest unlocked at the acknowledgement that she could be valued as herself, rather than as an echo of someone else. She reached out without thinking, her hand passing through his still incorporeal shoulder, but carrying intention even without solid contact, and she felt his response like warmth spreading through her entire body. "Tell me about the kingdom you want to build," Sarah said, shifting the conversation to safer ground, even as she recognized there was nothing safe about any of this, about resurrecting a lost king and challenging the established order and falling for someone who existed in the space between life and death. "If we succeed in restoring you fully, if we somehow manage to expose the council's corruption and break their hold on power, what comes next?" Fenris was quiet for a long moment, and she sensed him gathering thoughts that had been refined over 3 centuries of forced contemplation. "I've had a very long time to think about my failures," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom, purchased with centuries of regret. "In my first reign, I believed that changing laws would change hearts, that if I simply mandated equality and punished discrimination, people would adapt and accept the new order. I was naive about how deeply fear and prejudice can root themselves in culture, and I didn't build the support systems needed to help people unlearn generations of harmful thinking. If I return to power, I cannot simply decree that Omegas are equal and expect that to be enough. We'll need to dismantle the systems that benefit from oppression, yes, but we'll also need to create new institutions that actively work to heal the damage those systems caused. Education reform, so children learn accurate history and develop critical thinking instead of accepting propaganda. Economic restructuring, so Omegas have access to resources and opportunities that have been denied them. Support networks for those recovering from abuse and trauma. Justice that focuses on accountability and repair, rather than simply punishment. It will take generations to undo 3 centuries of damage, and I won't live to see the completion of that work even if I regain my full lifespan. Sarah felt something settle in her chest at those words, at the recognition that he understood sustainable change required patience and systemic thinking rather than dramatic gestures. "The council will fight back," she said, because she'd studied enough history to know power never surrendered willingly. "They'll use every resource they have to maintain control, and they'll absolutely frame your return as a threat. to stability and safety. People are comfortable with the devil they know, even if that devil oppresses them. Fenris's form flickered as anger surged through him, but he controlled it quickly. Another sign of the discipline he'd developed over centuries of forced patience. "Then we don't start with revolution," he said, strategy sharpening his tone. "We start with truth. You've been cataloging artifacts and documents that contradict the official history. We compile that evidence. We create a narrative that's so well supported, it becomes impossible to dismiss as conspiracy or madness. We find allies among those who've suffered under the council's rule, build a coalition that can stand against them not with violence, but with undeniable proof of their crimes. And we're patient, because rushing this will get us both killed and accomplish nothing except giving them martyrs to further demonize Omegas who dare to seek power." Over the following weeks, their work took on new dimensions as Fenris grew strong enough to manifest for hours at a time, and Sarah's own abilities began to surface in ways she'd never experienced before. The royal Omega bloodline wasn't just about lineage. It carried power that had been systematically suppressed through both the curse on Fenris and through centuries of breeding that power out of the Omega population through forced bonds and genetic manipulation. But with Fenris's presence awakening something dormant in her blood, Sarah began to access abilities that should have been impossible. She could sense emotions with unprecedented clarity, reading the truth behind people's words and recognizing deception instantly. She could influence others subtly, not controlling their minds, but making them more receptive to considering perspectives they'd normally dismiss. And most surprisingly, she could manipulate shadow the way Fenris did, bending darkness to her will for concealment or communication, or a dozen other purposes that grew more refined with practice. "This is what they feared," Fenris said, as he watched her practice moving shadows across the throne room floor, shaping them into images and words. "Omegas with royal blood don't just bear heirs. You're diplomats who can read any negotiation, strategists who can sense deception before it takes root, protectors who can hide your people from danger. My enemies didn't curse me just to remove a king. They cursed me to break the bloodline, to ensure no Omega would rise with these abilities again." But Sarah had risen, and with each passing day, she grew more confident in wielding power that felt like reclaiming a birthright that had been stolen before she was born. She began using her newfound abilities carefully in town, testing reactions and gathering information about the council's current activities. What she discovered was worse than she'd feared. The council had recently passed new laws restricting Omega movement and employment, framing it as protection during a supposed rise in violence against Omegas, but actually making it nearly impossible for Omegas to organize or resist. Several outspoken Omega activists had disappeared in recent months. Their families told they'd chosen to relocate, but Sarah's gifts allowing her to sense the grief and fear in those left behind that suggested darker truths. And most disturbing, she discovered the council was actively searching for descendants of the royal Omega line, using genealogy records and blood tests under the guise of a historical preservation project, but clearly intending to eliminate any potential threats to their power before those threats could fully manifest. "They know something is happening," Sarah told Fenris during one of their nightly sessions, her voice tight with worry. "They don't know specifically about you or about me yet, but they sense instability, change in the air, and they're taking preemptive action to secure their control." Fenris had regained enough substance by this point to appear almost fully solid, though he still couldn't maintain the form in daylight or venture beyond the palace grounds. His massive wolf form paced the throne room, frustration evident in every movement. "How long before they connect your presence at the palace with their growing paranoia?" he asked, though they both knew the answer. Sarah had maybe days, perhaps a week or two if fortune favored them, before someone in the council put together the pieces and realized the scholarly Omega they'd sent to catalog artifacts had instead begun to resurrect the king, whose downfall founded their entire power structure. If this story is keeping you on the edge of your seat, wondering how Sarah and Fenris will navigate the increasing danger closing in around them, please show your support by liking this video and sharing it with others who love supernatural romance with political intrigue and characters who fight for justice against impossible odds. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these stories to life, and we'd love to hear in the comments what you think Sarah should do next. Should she flee with Fenris before the council discovers them? Or should she stand and fight even though he's not yet strong enough to face them directly? The decision was taken out of her hands 3 days later when Sarah returned to her cottage after a session with Fenris to find her door broken open and her research scattered across the floor, clearly searched by people who knew exactly what they were looking for. Her heart hammered as she quickly assessed what was missing. They'd taken her most damning documents, the ones that clearly contradicted official history, but she'd been smart enough to hide copies in multiple locations, including several within the palace itself. What worried her more was the message left on her table, written in handwriting she recognized from council correspondence. You are summoned to appear before the council tomorrow at dawn to answer questions regarding your research findings and your activities at Shadowmane Palace. Failure to appear will be considered an admission of treason against Valdris and will result in immediate action. It was signed by High Counselor Theron Blackwood, who Sarah's research had identified as a direct descendant of one of the Alphas who'd orchestrated the original coup against Fenris. Sarah stood in her destroyed cottage for exactly 30 seconds, letting panic wash through her, and then consciously setting it aside. Because panic served no purpose except to cloud judgment, she had 3 choices. She could appear before the council and attempt to deflect their suspicions, buying more time for Fenris's restoration, but risking immediate imprisonment or death if they'd already decided she was a threat. She could flee Valdris entirely, abandoning everything she'd worked toward, but surviving to potentially fight another day from exile. Or she could go to Fenris tonight and not leave the palace again, committing fully to his restoration, and accepting that confrontation with the council was now inevitable, regardless of whether he was ready for it. The smart choice, the safe choice, was probably exile. She could take her research, find sanctuary in one of the outlying territories, and continue working to expose the council's corruption from a distance. But safety had never been what drew her to this work, and running now would mean abandoning not just Fenris, but every Omega in Valdris who suffered under the council's oppression. She packed quickly, taking only essentials and the copies of documents she'd hidden throughout her cottage. Then she wrote a letter to the 3 people in town she trusted most, other scholars who'd quietly supported her research over the years, telling them where to find additional evidence if anything happened to her, and asking them to spread the truth if the opportunity arose. She left the letter with a courier she'd paid well to deliver it only if she failed to return within 3 days, and then she walked through the darkness to Shadowmane Palace, for what might be the last time as a free woman, knowing the council would come for her by dawn, but unwilling to waste these final hours on fear when she could spend them finishing what she'd started. Fenris felt her approach before she entered the throne room, their bond now strong enough that he could sense her emotional state even at a distance. He'd taken full form in anticipation of her arrival, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw genuine fear in his ancient eyes. "They know," he said, statement rather than question, reading the truth in her expression and in the supplies she carried. "They know enough to be dangerous," Sarah confirmed, setting down her pack and moving directly to him, needing the comfort of proximity, even though she knew comfort was a luxury neither of them could afford right now. "They'll come by dawn, probably earlier. We need to finish your restoration. Tonight, or we need to run. And running just delays the inevitable while abandoning everyone who needs the truth you represent." Fenris reached out, his hand finally solid enough to cup her face, his touch gentle despite the power she could feel thrumming through him. "I cannot protect you yet," he said, and the anguish in his voice spoke to how deeply it cost him to admit that weakness. "I have perhaps 60% of my former strength, enough to hold this form indefinitely now, but not enough to face the council's enforcers if they come in numbers. Taking a stand tonight might mean we both die before we accomplish anything." Sarah leaned into his touch, letting herself have this moment of vulnerability before she had to be strong again. "Then we accelerate the restoration," she said. "You told me the curse could be broken faster if I was willing to give more, to open the bond completely." "What did you mean?" Fenris's expression shifted to something between hope and horror. A full bond, he said carefully. A true mate, bond freely chosen and consummated, would shatter the remaining curse instantly and restore me to full power. But Sarah, that kind of bond is permanent and profound. It would tie your life force to mine, mean you could never leave me without causing catastrophic damage to both of us. I will not pressure you into that choice simply because we're running out of time and options. You deserve better than a bond formed from desperation. Sarah felt the truth of what he was saying, understood that a mate bond wasn't something to enter lightly even under the best circumstances. But she also felt the rightness of the connection already growing between them, the way her wolf recognized his as partner and equal, despite the vast difference in their power levels. She'd been falling for him over these weeks of restoration, drawn not just to his strength but to his wisdom, his capacity for growth, his genuine commitment to justice that had survived 3 centuries of suffering. "Is it desperation?" she asked quietly. "If I've been wanting this for weeks, but was afraid to suggest it because I thought you were still too bound to your past." The bond between them flared at her admission, and Fenris made a sound low in his throat that was pure wolf, pure alpha, pure male responding to his mate's declaration. "I have loved 2 women in my very long life," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "and both of them have been Omega queens who saw past own fear and custom to what this kingdom could be if given the chance. Ilara was my spring, bright and brief and so beautiful it still hurts to remember losing her. You are my autumn, Sarah, deep and enduring and strong enough to weather storms that would break lesser souls. I love you not because you remind me of her, but because you are entirely yourself. And that self is extraordinary in ways she would have admired, and I am privileged to witness." Sarah kissed him then, rising on her toes to meet, lips that were finally solid enough to kiss properly, and felt the bond between them surge from tentative connection to absolute certainty. The mate bond snapped into place with an intensity that stole her breath, a rightness that resonated through every cell in her body, and she felt Fenris respond with equal force, his power suddenly accessible to her just as hers became available to him. The curse shattered like glass, 300 years of magical bindings breaking all at once with a sound that shook the palace foundations and sent light blazing through every window despite the late hour. Fenris's form solidified completely, becoming fully real and present in a way he hadn't been since the night of his imprisonment. Power radiated from him in waves that would have been terrifying if Sarah hadn't been connected to him intimately enough to feel his control, his careful restraint ensuring he didn't accidentally harm her with the sheer magnitude of what had just been unleashed. He lifted her easily, carrying her toward chambers that had once been royal apartments, and were now dusty remnants of past glory. But none of that mattered, because they had tonight. They had each other, and they had a bond that 3 centuries of curses hadn't been able to prevent. What happened in those chambers was private and profound, a claiming that was both physical and spiritual, a choice that cemented them as partners in every sense of the word. When dawn came and found them still tangled, together, neither sleeping because there was too much to discuss and too little time before the council's forces arrived, Sarah felt different in ways that went beyond the obvious. She could access Fenris's strength now, could feel the vast reservoir of power that was his birthright and his burden, and he could feel her abilities as well, the empathic gifts and shadow manipulation that were hers by blood. "They're coming," Fenris said quietly, his enhanced senses picking up movement on the road, leading to the palace long before normal hearing would detect anything. 20 enforcers, all alphas, all armed with silver and wolfsbane. The council is taking no chances. Sarah could feel them too now, could sense their determination and underlying fear, because they knew they were marching toward a confrontation with something that shouldn't exist, a king who should have stayed dead. "We could fight them," she said, because with Fenris at full strength, they probably could win that battle. But Fenris shook his head, strategy overriding the impulse toward immediate confrontation. "Fighting now makes us look like the threat they've claimed I always was," he said. "We need to be smarter than that. We let them take us to the council, We use that platform to expose their crimes publicly, and we force them to answer for 3 centuries of lies in front of witnesses they can't simply eliminate. It was a risk that could easily end with both of them dead, but it was also the only path that might actually lead to lasting change rather than just revenge. They dressed in clothing Sarah had stored in her pack, presenting themselves not as enemies of the state, but as scholars who'd made a historical discovery. When the enforcers crashed through the palace doors with weapons drawn, they found Sarah and Fenris waiting calmly in the throne room, making no threatening moves but also showing no fear. The lead enforcer, a grizzled alpha who looked like he'd fought in numerous campaigns, stared at Fenris with undisguised shock. The Wolf King. He breathed, and Sarah could sense his confusion, his worldview cracking because he'd been raised on stories of a monster, but stood before someone who radiated authority without malice. "I am Fenris Shadowmane," Fenris confirmed, his voice carrying through the hall with the resonance of true alpha command. "And I have returned to answer for my alleged crimes before the council that claims to rule in my absence. We will accompany you willingly, provided you extend the courtesy of allowing my mate to remain unharmed and treated with the respect due to a royal omega of the Luna bloodline." The enforcers exchanged uncertain glances, clearly not having expected cooperation or the revelation that Sarah carried royal blood. Their orders had probably been to subdue or kill on sight, but Fenris's willingness to submit to council authority undermined the narrative they'd been fed about him being a dangerous tyrant. The journey to the council. Chambers took hours, traveling from the remote palace to the heart of Valdris, where the council held court in buildings erected on the foundations of structures Fenris had once inhabited. Sarah used the time to extend her senses outward, reading the emotions of the growing crowd that gathered to watch their passage. Fear dominated, which was expected after 3 centuries of propaganda. But underneath she found curiosity and hope among the Omegas, who dared to look directly at her and Fenris. They'd heard whispers of someone challenging the council, of old truths being excavated, and some part of them wanted to believe that change might be possible, even if they'd been conditioned to accept their oppression as natural and inevitable. By the time they reached the council chambers, hundreds of people lined the streets, and Sarah noticed that the enforcers made no move to disperse them. Someone wanted witnesses to whatever happened next, which could work in their favor if they played this correctly. The council chambers themselves were designed to intimidate, with high ceilings, and the seats of power elevated above where defendants stood, forcing supplicants to look up at their judges. The 12 council members sat in their appointed positions, all alphas, all male, all descended from families Sarah's research had identified as participants in the original coup. High Counselor Farron Blackwood stood as they were brought before the assembly, his expression carefully controlled, but Sarah could sense satisfaction underneath. He thought he'd won by forcing this confrontation, believed having them in custody meant he could control the narrative. "Seraphina Nightbrook," he began, his voice carrying the formal tones of official judgment. "You were assigned to catalog historical artifacts, and instead you have engaged in necromancy and sedition, raising a threat to this kingdom that we destroyed 3 centuries ago for the safety of all Valdris citizens. How do you answer these charges?" Sarah took a breath, feeling Fenris's presence solid beside her through their bond, and then she did what she'd been trained to do her entire scholarly career. She presented evidence. "I answer them by presenting historical documents that prove every claim about King Fenris Shadowmane's supposed tyranny and madness was fabricated by those who murdered his mate, slaughtered royal Omega bloodlines, and seized power through a coup disguised as righteous intervention." She pulled out the documents she'd carried, copies of original council records from 300 years ago that showed premeditation, conspiracy, and the deliberate use of blood magic to curse Fenris, rather than simply killing him, because they needed his conscious suffering to fuel the curse that suppressed Omega abilities throughout the kingdom. The chamber erupted in chaos as counselors shouted denials, and the growing crowd of observers pressed closer, demanding to see the evidence for themselves. Theron tried to restore order, but his voice was drowned out by Fenris's, amplified by alpha command that cut through the noise with undeniable authority. "You stand on foundations built from the murdered bodies of my people. Fenris said, and though his voice was calm, the fury underneath was evident to everyone present. You have ruled for 3 centuries by maintaining a lie so pervasive that people accepted oppression as natural order. But every system built on lies eventually crumbles when confronted with truth. And the truth is this: your ancestors were cowards who feared equality, who murdered those they should have protected, and who cursed an entire bloodline to prevent Omegas from ever again accessing the power that is their birthright. I have returned not to reclaim a throne, but to see justice served, and these wrongs corrected, and I will not be silenced again by those who profit from maintaining corrupt systems. Before you find out how this confrontation ends, and whether Sarah and Fenris can actually achieve justice against a council that's held power for 3 centuries, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Hit that like button if you're invested in this story, and drop a comment telling us whether you think the council will yield to evidence and reason, or if Sarah and Fenris will need to take more direct action to liberate Valdris from generations of oppression. Your engagement helps us continue creating stories about characters who refuse to accept injustice even when fighting back seems impossible. The documents Sarah had presented were being passed through the crowd now, beyond the council's ability to suppress them, and she could sense the shift in emotional tenor as people read evidence that contradicted everything they'd been taught. The council couldn't simply dismiss or destroy the documents without confirming guilt, but accepting them meant acknowledging that their entire governmental structure rested on lies and murder. Theron tried to regain control of the situation by attacking Fenris's character directly. "You speak of justice," he said, his voice heavy with manufactured concern. "But you were willing to bond with an Omega less than half your age after mere weeks of acquaintance. You cursed her to a life tied to a man she barely knows, demonstrating the same disregard for Omega autonomy that you claim to oppose. It was a clever attack, designed to turn Sarah into a victim and Fenris into a predator, but it failed because Sarah had her own voice and her own power, and she was done letting alphas speak for her. I chose this bond freely," Sarah said, her voice carrying through the chambers with confidence that made several council members flinch. "I chose it knowing exactly what it meant, understanding the permanence and implications, because I recognized in Fenris a partner who would fight beside me rather than for me, who would build systems that empower rather than control. You want to frame me as a victim because that fits your narrative about Omegas needing alpha protection. But I am a scholar who has spent years excavating the truth you tried to bury. And I am a royal Omega whose bloodline you failed to completely exterminate despite 3 centuries of systematic hunting. I am not a victim. I am a threat to everything you've built on the corpses of people like me. And that is why you're actually afraid." The crowd's response was electric, particularly among the Omegas present who had never heard one of their own speak with such authority in a public forum. Sarah could sense their awakening, the way her words and presence challenged assumptions they'd internalized about their own capabilities and worth. This was what the council had feared most, not Fenris's raw power, but the inspiration that power in Omega hands represented to others who'd been taught to see themselves as lesser. Theron realized he was losing control of the situation, losing the narrative, and losing the crowd's support that he needed to maintain an appearance of legitimate authority. He made a desperate decision, signaling enforcers positioned around the chamber to take action. "The defendants have admitted to sedition and necromancy," he declared, trying to speed past proper procedure to reach a predetermined conclusion. "The sentence is death, to be carried out immediately before they can spread further corruption through the kingdom." Sarah felt Fenris's power surge in response to the threat, felt him preparing to defend them both, but she also felt something else through their bond. His restraint, his unwillingness to strike first and prove the council's claims about his dangerous nature. So Sarah acted instead, drawing on abilities that were newly awakened but felt instinctual, pulling shadows from every corner of the chamber and weaving them into a barrier that stopped the advancing enforcers without harming them. The crowd gasped at the display of power, at visible proof that Omegas could wield abilities that rivaled alpha strength, and several council members looked genuinely terrified for the first time since this confrontation began. "You will not execute us," Sarah said calmly, maintaining the shadow barrier with one hand, while using the other to gesture toward the documents still circulating through the crowd. Not because you couldn't eventually overwhelm us with numbers, but because doing so in front of hundreds of witnesses who now know the truth about your corruption would turn us into martyrs and guarantee the uprising you've been trying to prevent. You're trapped by the very public spectacle you created, forced to either acknowledge the evidence against you or reveal yourselves as the tyrants you've claimed Fenris was. It was a gamble built on the assumption that the council valued their appearance of legitimacy more than they valued silencing threats, that they would choose survival through adaptation over a last stand that would expose them completely. For a long moment, the chamber held its breath, waiting to see which way the balance would tip. Then something unexpected happened. One of the enforcers, the grizzled veteran who'd led the force that captured them, stepped forward and removed his weapon harness, setting it on the ground in a gesture of surrender that echoed through the centuries to similar moments when warriors chose conscience over orders. "I have served the council for 30 years, he said, his voice rough but clear. "I have enforced laws I was told were just, suppressed uprisings I was told threatened stability, and hunted people I was told were dangerous to the kingdom's peace. But I have also watched Omegas suffer under systems that benefit alphas like me, watched talented people denied opportunities because of their designation, watched children learn to hate themselves for traits they were born with. If these documents are genuine, if the history we've been taught is a lie designed to justify oppression, then I cannot continue to serve a council that built its power on murder and deception." Other enforcers began to follow his lead. Not all of them, but enough to make it clear that the council could no longer count on unified support from their military force. And then Omegas in the crowd began to speak up, sharing stories of injustice they'd experienced, asking questions about rights that had been stripped away, demanding explanations for laws that served no purpose except to limit their autonomy. The council's facade of control crumbled as the public questioning they'd always prevented finally began in earnest, and Theron looked like a man watching his entire world collapse around him. But Fenris didn't push for immediate overthrow or violent retribution, and Sarah realized through their bond that this was strategic patience born from 3 centuries of reflection. "The council stands accused of crimes spanning generations," Fenris said, his voice measured and formal. "These accusations deserve proper investigation, with evidence examined by impartial parties and testimony taken from all affected populations. I propose an interim governing coalition, including representatives from all designations, not just alphas, to oversee this investigation and ensure fairness in the process. If the council members are innocent of wrongdoing, they will be exonerated and can resume their positions. If they are guilty, they will face justice appropriate to their crimes, which should focus on accountability and repair rather than simple revenge. In the meantime, all discriminatory laws will be suspended pending review, and Omega citizens will have their full rights restored immediately." It was a reasonable proposal that addressed the crowd's demand for justice while avoiding immediate chaos, and Sarah could sense the shift as people recognized. This wasn't a tyrant seeking to replace one oppressive system with another, but a leader trying to establish actual fairness. The council had no good options left. They could refuse and spark the uprising they'd feared, or they could accept and submit to an investigation that would inevitably expose their corruption. Theron looked at his fellow council members, reading in their expressions the same calculation, and finally nodded with the bitter resignation of someone who knows when they've been outmaneuvered. "The council accepts an interim coalition and independent investigation," he said, each word clearly, costing him. "But King Fenris cannot serve as an impartial investigator given his personal stake in the outcome. He must recuse himself from the process and allow truly neutral parties to examine the evidence." Fenris smiled, and it wasn't a kind expression. "I agree completely," he said, "which is why I'm appointing my mate, Seraphina of the Luna bloodline, as chief investigator. She is a trained historian with no political allegiances except to truth, and she will have full authority to access all council records, interview all relevant parties, and publish findings publicly so the citizens of Valdris can make informed judgments about how they wish to be governed going forward." The investigation that followed took months, and revealed layers of corruption deeper than even Sarah's preliminary research had suggested. The original coup against Fenris had indeed been about preventing Omega equality, but it had also been about economic exploitation, with the conspirator families using their new power to claim resources in territories that had previously belonged to Omega-held trusts and communes. The systematic suppression of Omega abilities hadn't just prevented threats to alpha dominance, it had also conveniently made Omegas more vulnerable to exploitation in labor markets and bond markets. The disappearances of Omega activists in recent years weren't isolated incidents, but part of a coordinated program to eliminate anyone who might organize resistance. And the Council's search for royal bloodline descendants hadn't been simple paranoia, but a response to prophecies in their own archives, warning that the curse on Fenris would eventually break when a true heir appeared, which they'd known was only a matter of time despite their best efforts at bloodline elimination. Sarah documented everything with scholarly precision, creating a historical record that couldn't be dismissed or distorted by future generations. She interviewed hundreds of witnesses, both those who'd suffered under council rule and those who'd benefited from it, building a comprehensive picture of how oppression functioned in Valdris and what would be needed to dismantle it. And she worked with the interim coalition to design new governmental structures that distributed power more equitably, including mandatory representation for all designations, term limits to prevent entrenched corruption, transparency requirements that made all governmental actions subject to public scrutiny, and independent oversight bodies that could investigate wrongdoing without political interference. It wasn't perfect, and there were fierce debates about every detail, but it was better than what had existed before, and it created mechanisms for continued improvement, rather than assuming they'd gotten everything right on the first attempt. The council members themselves faced varied consequences, based on their level of involvement in ongoing crimes, versus simply inheriting corrupt systems. Theron, and 3 others who'd actively participated in recent disappearances and violence, were sentenced to significant prison terms, with their assets seized to fund reparations for affected families. Several others were removed from power, but not imprisoned, found guilty of perpetuating unjust systems, but not of direct harm. And a few, those who genuinely tried to reform from within, but lacked the power to overcome entrenched interests, were allowed to serve in the new government under close oversight. The goal wasn't vengeance, but accountability paired with opportunities for redemption through concrete actions, which Fenris insisted on because he'd learned that sustainable change required converting former opponents when possible, rather than simply defeating them. As spring arrived, and the new governmental structures began to take shape, Sarah and Fenris returned to Shadowmane Palace, not as rulers, but as teachers. Fenris established an academy for training Omega leaders, providing education in governance, law, history, and strategic thinking that had been systematically denied to Omegas for generations. Sarah ran the historical research division, training new scholars in methods for excavating truth from biased sources and creating accurate records that future generations could trust. They opened the palace as a public space, converting royal chambers into libraries and meeting rooms where citizens could gather to debate policy and organize community initiatives. The old throne room where Sarah had first awakened Fenris became a museum documenting both the coup's crimes and the resistance that eventually overthrew it, serving as a reminder of both the worst and best of what people were capable of achieving. Their bond deepened as they worked side by side to rebuild a kingdom scarred by centuries of injustice. There were setbacks and frustrations, times when progress seemed impossible and opposition to change felt overwhelming. But they had each other, had a connection that transcended normal mate bonds because it had been forged in the crucible of resurrection and revolution, tested by forces that would have broken lesser partnerships. Sarah discovered she was pregnant 2 years into the restoration work, and the news spread through Valdris like wildfire, because it represented something that hadn't existed for 3 centuries, a royal Omega carrying the heir to power, not as a vulnerable victim, but as an equal partner in governance who would raise a child in a kingdom transformed by their combined efforts. If you've followed this journey from the shadows under the throne to the dawn of a new era for Valdris, Thank you for being part of this story. Before we conclude with the epilogue, please hit that subscribe button if you believe in stories about characters who refuse to accept injustice, who fight for systematic change rather than just personal victory, and who prove that love can be both a personal joy and a catalyst for revolutionary transformation. Drop a comment telling us what element of this story resonated with you most, and share it with anyone who needs a reminder that courage and compassion can overcome even centuries of entrenched oppression. The child born to Sarah and Fenris was a daughter they named Alara, honoring the Luna Queen who'd been lost but never forgotten. She grew up in a kingdom fundamentally different from the one that had existed before her parents' unlikely reunion, surrounded by Omega teachers and Alpha mentors, learning from the start that power came in many forms, and leadership meant service rather than domination. Fenris taught her strategy and restraint, the patience required for sustainable change, and the discipline needed to wield power responsibly. Sarah taught her scholarship and skepticism, how to question narratives and excavate truth from sources designed to obscure it. And both of them taught her that the most important bonds were those built on respect and choice rather than obligation and fear. As young Alara played in the gardens where 300 years earlier her father had walked with another queen who'd been murdered for daring to envision equality, Sarah and Fenris watched from the shadows they'd both learned to command. "Do you think we've done enough?" Sarah asked. Because even after years of transformation, she sometimes worried they'd missed something crucial, left some injustice unaddressed, failed someone who needed their help. Fenris pulled her close, his solid warmth a constant reminder that he was truly alive again, truly present in ways that went beyond the Shadow King she'd first awakened. "We've done what we could with the time we have," he said gently, "and we've built institutions that will continue the work after we're gone. That's all any leader can hope to accomplish, creating systems strong enough to survive our absence and wise enough to adapt to challenges we can't foresee." Sarah leaned into him, watching their daughter chase butterflies through sunlight that seemed brighter than it had been when she'd first arrived at this palace, believing she was simply cataloging artifacts. She'd found so much more than historical documents in the shadows under the throne. She'd found purpose and power and partnership, found a love that had literally resurrected a dead king and revolutionized a kingdom. And she'd found herself, the person she'd always been meant to be, before systems of oppression tried to teach her she was lesser, simply for being born Omega. "Thank you," she whispered to Fenris, knowing he would understand she meant thanks not just for their personal relationship, but for believing an orphan scholar could help transform a kingdom, for trusting her with power and responsibility, for showing her that she was worthy of standing beside a king, not as decoration, but as equal. "Thank you," Fenris replied, and through their bond she felt the depths of what he meant. Gratitude not just for breaking his curse, but for giving him a second chance at life and love, for showing him that redemption was possible even after catastrophic failure, for being patient with his grief, while helping him build a future that honored his past without being trapped by it. They stood together as the sun set over Valdris, watching shadows lengthen across a kingdom that had learned, finally, that darkness wasn't something to fear, but something to understand and work with, just as light needed shadow to create depth and definition. And in the distance, the old throne in the palace behind them stood empty, a reminder that true power never came from sitting above others, but from standing beside them, that the best leaders were those who used their strength to lift others up, rather than keep them down. Decades later, when historians wrote about this period, they would call it the Second Founding, the era when Valdris rediscovered principles it had lost and rebuilt itself, on foundations of actual justice rather than comfortable lies. They would write about the Wolf King who returned from shadow and death, about the royal Omega who resurrected him through courage and scholarship, about the bond that transformed them both and the kingdom they saved together. But those future historians, many of them Omegas trained in the academy Sarah and Fenris established, would emphasize that the real heroes were the ordinary citizens who chose to believe truth over propaganda, who demanded accountability from power, who did the daily work of dismantling oppression and building something better in its place. Because lasting change never came from singular heroes, but from collective effort, from people across all designations recognizing their shared humanity and refusing to let artificial divisions prevent them from creating the world they deserved to live in. And somewhere in the shadows of the old palace, if you listened carefully, you might hear whispers of gratitude from those who'd been lost to the coup's violence, Omega queens and scholars and warriors whose names had been erased, but whose legacy lived on in every law passed for equality. Every Omega child taught they were worthy of power. Every Alpha learning that true strength meant protecting others rather than dominating them. The shadows remembered what history tried to forget. And now those shadows danced in celebration rather than mourning, because justice delayed for 300 years had finally, imperfectly, but genuinely, arrived. The Wolf King lived again, and this time his kingdom would endure not because of fear, but because of hope, not because of oppression, but because of liberation, not because some people held power over others, but because power itself had been reimagined as something shared and wielded for the benefit of all.